Emily stood by the window, watching as the sky darkened with an ominous hue. The weather forecast had predicted a storm, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The clouds gathered like an army in the sky, thick and swirling, tinged with a sickly green that made her stomach churn. The wind was picking up, carrying with it a strange, almost electric charge. It felt like something was brewing, something more than just a storm. She shivered and stepped back from the window, pulling the heavy velvet drapes closed. The house was old, too old, really, and its creaks and groans made her uneasy. Emily had never felt truly comfortable here, not even as a child when her grandmother used to bring her for summer visits. Now that the house was hers, the feeling of dread had only intensified. It was as though the walls were holding secrets, whispering things just out of earshot. The inheritance had come suddenly. One moment, her grandmother was lively and full of stories, and the next, she was gone, leaving Emily with a house she had never wanted. Her parents had passed years before, so Emily was alone in the world. Now, all that remained was this sprawling, isolated Victorian mansion perched at the edge of the woods. Emily sighed, pushing thoughts of her grandmother's death aside. It had been too much to process at once, her grief, the estate, and the memories of this strange, haunting place. She tried to distract herself, focusing on the present task, settling in for her first night alone. She had spent the day unpacking the few belongings she had brought with her, but the house still felt empty, echoing with the absence of its former occupant. Outside, the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, vibrating through the floorboards under her feet. The sound was distant at first, but there was something about it that made Emily's skin prickle. She had always hated thunderstorms, though she had never really understood why. There was no traumatic memory associated with them, no logical reason for her fear. Still, they had always left her feeling anxious, unsettled. A loud crack of thunder jolted her from her thoughts, and she gasped involuntarily, her heart racing. The storm was getting closer, and with it, a strange heaviness began to settle over the house. Emily tried to shake it off, reasoning that it was just the old structure reacting to the changing weather, but the feeling lingered, making her feel as though something was pressing down on her, watching her from the shadows. She moved through the house, checking the windows to make sure they were all closed. The wind had begun to howl now, rattling the panes and sending gusts through the cracks in the old wooden frames. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she made her way to the kitchen, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent house. She told herself she was being silly, that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But even as she thought it, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Another clap of thunder shook the house, and the lights flickered. Emily froze, her heart thumping in her chest. The power stayed on for now, but the storm was only just beginning. She glanced at the old grandfather clock in the hallway. It was nearly midnight. She hadn't realized how late it had gotten. With a sigh, Emily grabbed a glass of water and headed for the stairs. She told herself she just needed sleep, that the tension in her chest would ease once she rested. But as she ascended the staircase, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. A soft, almost imperceptible creak, as though someone was standing just behind her. Emily turned, shining her flashlight down the stairwell. Nothing. She tried to calm her breathing, but the silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves. She shook her head and continued upward, telling herself she was just tired and jumpy. Yet, with every step she took, she felt that invisible weight growing heavier, as though some unseen force was bearing down on her. When she reached the landing, she paused for a moment, her hand resting on the banister. She had the sudden, unsettling feeling that if she turned around now, she might see something, or someone, standing there. She resisted the urge, forcing herself to focus on getting to her room. But as she turned toward the hallway, she thought she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow flitting across the wall at the far end of the corridor. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the shadow had looked like a person. But when she turned her head fully, there was nothing there, just the empty hallway and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Emily quickened her pace, almost running the last few steps to her bedroom. She shut the door behind her with a shaky hand, turning the lock with a soft click. Safe inside, she leaned against the door, trying to collect herself. The wind outside howled louder now, and the storm was in full force. The power flickered again, and this time it didn't come back. Her bedroom was plunged into darkness, save for the faint light of her flashlight, which she clutched like a lifeline. She lit a few candles around the room, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the walls. Emily couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been growing since the storm began. The house seemed different now, darker and more oppressive, as though something had awakened with the thunder. She tried to distract herself by picking up one of the old books she had found in her grandmother's study. It was a collection of local legends and ghost stories, the kind of thing her grandmother had always loved. Emily hadn't thought much of it at first, just another piece of the house's strange history. But now, as she flipped through the pages, something caught her eye. One of the stories was about a house, much like her grandmother's, that had stood for centuries at the edge of the woods. According to the tale, the house was cursed, its inhabitants driven mad by the spirits that lingered within its walls. They said the house had a will of its own, that it fed on fear, drawing its occupants deeper into its twisted embrace. Emily shuddered, closing the book abruptly. She knew it was just a story, just a piece of folklore meant to scare children. But as the storm raged outside and the shadows grew longer, she couldn't help but feel that there was some truth to it. The house felt alive tonight, its presence wrapping around her like the storm itself, suffocating and relentless. She climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room, watching the flickering shadows dance across the walls. She tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that the storm was playing tricks on her senses. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong here, something she couldn't quite explain. And as the thunder rolled once more, shaking the very foundation of the house, Emily knew that whatever it was just getting started. Emily sat upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest as the storm raged outside. The power had gone out almost an hour ago, plunging the house into complete darkness. The wind howled fiercely, rattling the old windows in their frames, while the thunder cracked so loudly it felt like the very foundation of the house was shaking. She wrapped the blankets tighter around her, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that had been gnawing at her ever since she arrived. But it wasn't just the storm outside that unsettled her now. It was something else, something inside the house. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt it in the air, a heaviness that pressed against her skin, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It was as though the air had thickened, filled with a presence she couldn't see but could feel, lurking in every shadow, in every corner. Her grandmother's house had always been strange, but tonight it felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Emily kept telling herself it was her imagination, that it was just an old house creaking and groaning in the storm, but the feeling persisted, stubborn and unrelenting. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. It had stopped, its hands frozen at 12:01, a few minutes after the power had gone out. Emily shifted uncomfortably, the candlelight casting eerie, flickering shadows across the walls. She told herself to stop being ridiculous. There was nothing here, nothing but her and her overactive imagination. But then she heard it, a faint creak just outside her bedroom door. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the door, her mind racing. The logical part of her knew it could be the house settling or the wind pushing against the walls, but the part of her that had been raised on ghost stories couldn't help but wonder if something else was out there. She swallowed hard, listening intently. Another creak, this one closer. Emily felt a wave of cold wash over her. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, every instinct screaming at her to stay put, to not open the door. But curiosity won out over fear. Slowly, she rose from the bed, her legs trembling as she approached the door. She grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, its weak beam cutting through the darkness as she edged closer. The door loomed before her, its old wood worn and faded from years of use. For a moment she hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. What if there was something on the other side? What if she wasn't alone in this house after all? She could feel her pulse quicken, her breathing shallow and uneven. Gathering her courage, she slowly turned the knob, the door creaking open with an agonizingly loud groan. Emily winced at the sound, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she peered out into the hallway. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the old worn wallpaper and the dusty floorboards. She took a deep breath and stepped into the hall, her footsteps soft but echoing in the silence. The house was eerily quiet now, save for the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional gust of wind. The air felt colder out here, and the oppressive heaviness she had felt in her room seemed to intensify. She swept the flashlight down the length of the hallway, her heart skipping a beat when the light landed on the far end. For just a moment she thought she saw a figure standing there, a dark shape, tall and still, watching her. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat as she pointed the flashlight directly at the spot. The beam wavered as her hands shook, but the figure was gone. Emily's heart raced as she backed up a step, her mind whirling. Had she imagined it? Was the storm playing tricks on her eyes? Or was there really someone or something there? The silence pressed down on her, growing heavier with every passing second. Emily forced herself to move, her feet carrying her down the hallway, her body trembling with each step. She didn't know where she was going, but she felt compelled to keep moving, as though staying still would somehow make things worse. She reached the stairs and stopped, peering down into the darkness below. The living room stretched out beneath her, its shadowy corners now cloaked in pitch black. She took a tentative step down the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath her weight. She winced at the noise, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. She had only made it halfway down the staircase when another sound reached her ears, a soft whisper, almost too quiet to hear. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she strained to listen. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as though it were coming from right beside her. "Emily." Her blood ran cold. She turned abruptly, shining the flashlight behind her, but there was nothing there. Panic surged through her as she whipped the light around, illuminating every inch of the staircase. But she saw nothing. No one. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, watching her from the darkness just beyond the reach of her light. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. Emily backed away from the staircase, her mind racing. She knew she hadn't imagined the voice. It had been real, so real that it had sent a chill down her spine. But there was no one there. She bit her lip, her fingers gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't stay here, frozen in fear. She needed to get out of the house, storm or no storm. As she turned to make her way back down the stairs, another sound stopped her dead in her tracks. A loud, deliberate creak, this time coming from directly above her. She whipped around, pointing the flashlight up toward the landing at the top of the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it. Something dark and tall standing at the edge of the banister, watching her. The beam of light wavered as she stared, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It was a figure, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as though observing her with curious, hollow eyes. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away slowly, her heart thundering in her chest. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, bearing down on her like a physical force. She had the sudden, terrifying realization that it wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real, and it was getting closer. The figure began to move slowly and deliberately, its form blending into the shadows as it descended the stairs. Emily stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as panic gripped her. She turned and bolted down the rest of the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground as she raced for the front door. But when she reached it, she froze. The door was wide open, the storm raging just outside. Rain lashed at the walls and the wind howled with a deafening fury. But it wasn't the storm that made her hesitate. It was what she saw standing just beyond the threshold. Another figure, tall and gaunt, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. Emily's mind reeled as she backed away from the door, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure outside didn't move, but its presence felt even more menacing than the one inside the house. She was trapped, caught between two horrors with no way out. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the oppressive weight of the house bearing down on her like a living thing. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she backed up against the wall, her mind racing. She was no longer sure what was real and what was a product of her fear, but one thing was certain. The house was no longer just a house. It was alive and it had her trapped in its grasp. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm outside seemed to calm. The howling wind subsided, and the rain softened to a gentle patter. Emily stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes darting between the open door and the dark staircase. She could no longer see the figures, but she could feel them, lurking in the shadows, waiting. She wasn't alone, not anymore. Something had awakened in the house, something that had been lying dormant for years. And now it was watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. But Emily wasn't sure she had the strength to face whatever was lurking in the darkness. Not alone. Not tonight. Emily awoke in the cold, oppressive darkness, her heart pounding in her chest as if it were trying to escape. She had no memory of falling asleep, only of the suffocating fear that had gripped her as she fled from the looming shadows in the house. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by an unseen force that seemed to thicken the air around her. She blinked several times, trying to adjust her eyes to the darkness, but the room remained as black as ink. It took her a moment to realize something was wrong. This wasn't her room. She sat up quickly, her breath catching in her throat. The familiar walls of her grandmother's Victorian house had disappeared, replaced by an unfamiliar space, a place that felt wrong on every level. The dimensions of the room seemed distorted, the walls too close and slanted at impossible angles, as though the house itself had twisted into something foreign, something malevolent. Emily's heart pounded harder. She reached for her flashlight on the nightstand, only there was no nightstand. Her hands brushed against cold, damp wood, slick with moisture. Panic set in as she realized that everything she knew, the bed, the furniture, the familiar textures of the house, had vanished. She was somewhere else, somewhere that defied reason. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. She stumbled toward where the door should have been, only to find nothing but solid, cold wood in its place. She felt along the walls, her fingers tracing over the rough surface, searching for any sign of a doorknob, a latch, anything. But the door was gone. The room had no exit. Emily's breathing grew shallow as she turned in circles, panic overtaking her rational mind. This couldn't be real. Doors didn't just disappear. Rooms didn't change overnight. She tried to remember if she had left her room at all, if she had wandered in her sleep. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind was foggy, her memories jumbled, as though something had tampered with them. She pounded her fists against the walls, the sound echoing in the small space, but the walls didn't budge. There was no answer to her desperate cries, no sign that anyone else could hear her. It was as though she had been swallowed by the house itself, trapped in a space that shouldn't exist. The air grew colder. She shivered, pulling her arms around herself for warmth. The silence pressed down on her like a physical weight, broken only by her own labored breathing. And then, just when she thought she might go mad from the suffocating quiet, she heard it. A soft whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Emily!" She froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It wasn't her own voice or that of a stranger. It was her grandmother's. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. She hadn't heard her grandmother's voice in months, not since the funeral, not since she had been left alone in this cursed house. But here it was, echoing softly in the darkness, calling her name. "Emily!" She wanted to scream, to tell the voice to leave her alone, but her throat felt tight as though her fear had taken hold of her vocal cords. She backed away from the sound, her hands trembling as she held them out in front of her like a shield. But there was nowhere to go, no door, no escape. She was trapped with whatever was in this room with her, and it was getting closer. She could feel the air grow colder still, a biting chill that seeped into her bones. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a strange, unsettling sensation. It was as though the walls themselves were shifting around her, expanding and contracting like the lungs of some great, slumbering beast. Emily pressed herself against one of the walls, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the sound of the voice. It was so complete, so total, that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room entirely. Emily closed her eyes, praying that when she opened them again, everything would be back to normal. But when she finally forced her eyelids open, she saw something that made her heart stop. The room was no longer empty. At first, she couldn't make out the figure standing in the corner. It was little more than a shadow, its form indistinct and shifting, as though it were caught between one reality and another. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to see it more clearly. It was tall, much taller than any person should be, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face, or what passed for a face, was obscured by darkness, but Emily could feel its gaze on her, cold and unblinking. It didn't move, but she could feel it watching her, studying her. She pressed her back harder against the wall, her heart racing in her chest. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs wouldn't move, and her voice felt trapped in her throat. All she could do was stare at the thing in the corner, praying it wouldn't come any closer. And then, slowly, it began to move. The figure took a single step toward her, its body shifting unnaturally as it did so, like a shadow stretching across a wall. Emily's breath hitched as she watched it, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. She had to get out. She had to escape this nightmare. But the walls were solid, the door was gone, and there was nowhere left to run. The figure took another step, its elongated form drifting closer to her. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed herself harder against the wall, her mind screaming for her to fight, to flee, to do something, anything. But she was frozen in place, trapped by her own terror. "Emily," the voice whispered again, this time right next to her ear. She gasped and turned, expecting to see the figure looming over her, but there was nothing there. The air was cold, so cold it burned her skin, and the shadows seemed to deepen around her, closing in like a noose. Her chest tightened, and she felt as though the walls themselves were pressing against her, squeezing the air from her lungs. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the pressure suddenly lifted. The walls around her seemed to shimmer for a moment, and then, just as quickly as it had vanished, the door reappeared. It was right in front of her now, solid and real. She stared at it, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The figure was gone. The room was quiet once more. The oppressive atmosphere that had suffocated her moments ago now faded to a distant memory. Emily's legs shook beneath her as she stumbled toward the door, her fingers fumbling with the doorknob. She half expected it to disappear again, to trap her in that hellish space forever. But when she turned the knob, the door opened with a soft creak. She stepped out into the hallway, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she slammed the door shut behind her. The familiar walls of her grandmother's house greeted her, but they no longer felt safe. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hold the threat of something lurking just out of sight. She pressed her back against the door, her mind reeling from what had just happened. She glanced around, half expecting to see the figure standing somewhere in the darkness. But the hallway was empty. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The house was still, too still. Emily pushed away from the door, her legs trembling as she made her way down the hallway. She had no idea what had just happened, whether it had been a nightmare or something far worse. But one thing was certain. The house was no longer just a house. Something had changed. It had come alive, shifting and bending reality in ways that defied explanation. And it wasn't finished with her yet. She could feel it lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to let her guard down, to step into its trap once again. Emily knew she had to get out of the house, but where would she go? The storm outside raged on, and the woods surrounding the estate were dense and foreboding. She was trapped not by walls or locked doors, but by something far more terrifying, an unseen force that had woven itself into the very fabric of the house, and it wanted her. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching her with its hollow eyes. But there was nothing, only shadows. For now. The house was quiet now, as if the storm outside had finally drained it of its malevolent energy. Emily stood in the grand hallway, her back pressed against the old, warped door she had just slammed shut. Her breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. The heavy silence enveloped her, an almost tangible force that seemed to press against her skin. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something sour, something old and rotten that lingered beneath the surface. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing, but when she opened them again, the house seemed different. The shadows were deeper, more sinister, crawling along the floor and walls like living things. The edges of the room appeared blurred, as though the house itself were losing definition, breaking down into something else. Her mind churned, refusing to accept what she had seen in that room, but no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, she knew the truth now. The house was alive, and it had always been waiting for her. Emily had inherited more than just her grandmother's old house. She had inherited its curse, its hunger. For as long as she could remember, the house had been a looming presence in her life, an enigma that her grandmother had both revered and feared. The stories her grandmother had told her as a child about spirits, shadows, and things that lived in the walls had always seemed like harmless folklore. But now, in the cold, suffocating grip of reality, Emily understood. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts or memories. It was the ghost. An entity in and of itself, ancient, insidious, and utterly relentless. It didn't just contain darkness, it was darkness. Emily pushed herself off the door, her legs unsteady, and staggered down the hallway toward the parlor. She had to get out. She had to leave before the house claimed her like it had claimed so many others. But as she reached the threshold of the room, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her heart seized in her chest. In the flickering candlelight, her grandmother stood before her. Emily blinked, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't possible. Her grandmother had been dead for months, and yet there she was, standing by the fireplace, her eyes fixed on Emily with a sorrowful expression. She looked exactly as Emily remembered her, frail but graceful, her silver hair pinned up in loose waves, wearing the same floral dress she had been buried in. "Grandma," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The figure smiled softly, but there was something wrong with the smile, something unsettling. Her grandmother's eyes, once warm and full of life, now appeared empty, devoid of any spark. They were hollow, lifeless. A chill ran down Emily's spine, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, caught between fear and the strange, inexplicable longing to believe this apparition was real. "You've finally come home," her grandmother said, her voice soft and distant, like a memory fading in and out. "The house has been waiting for you, Emily, just like it waited for me." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "What do you mean? Why is this happening? What does the house want?" Her grandmother took a step closer, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The house doesn't want, it needs. It needs someone to feed it, to sustain it. It thrives on our fear, our pain. It has for generations. We are part of it now, Emily. You can't leave." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I refuse to believe that. There has to be a way out. I'm not going to stay here and die like you did." Her grandmother's face twisted, her expression shifting from sorrow to something darker, something hungry. The soft maternal tone in her voice turned cold. "You don't have a choice, Emily. None of us did. The house chooses who stays and who goes, and it has chosen you. Emily took a step back, her mind reeling. She had to think, had to find a way out. But the walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing longer, darker, until they felt like hands reaching for her, pulling her deeper into the house's embrace. The air grew heavy again, thick with the scent of decay and dampness, and the faint sound of whispering echoed through the halls. It was as if the house was speaking to her, beckoning her to surrender, to give herself up to it. She turned on her heel and ran, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the house. She had no idea where she was going. There was no plan, no clear escape route. Every door she passed felt like a trap, every hallway a maze designed to lead her deeper into the house's belly. But she couldn't stop. She had to keep moving. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling her head with voices she didn't recognize. They called her name over and over again, as if trying to lure her back. Emily clamped her hands over her ears, desperate to block them out, but the voices penetrated her mind like needles, sharp and relentless. Emily. Emily. Suddenly she found herself in front of the door to the basement. It stood slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it deeper than any she had ever seen. She knew instinctively that this was where the heart of the house lay, its core, its essence. And somehow, she knew that if she went down there, there would be no coming back. But there was no other choice. She had to face it. Emily swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she reached for the doorknob. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, and the voices quieted as if waiting for her to make her decision. She hesitated for only a moment, then pulled the door open wide. The darkness yawned before her, a void that seemed to go on forever. She descended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight, the cold air biting at her skin. The deeper she went, the stronger the pull became, like a magnet drawing her closer to something ancient and unknowable. At the bottom of the stairs, the air was so thick with moisture that she could hardly breathe. And then she saw it. The room at the bottom of the stairs was unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls pulsed, alive with a faint, sickly glow that seemed to emanate from deep within the house itself. In the center of the room was an enormous black mass, undulating and shifting as though it were breathing. It was a grotesque organic thing, like the heart of some monstrous creature. It throbbed with life, exuding a sense of malevolent power that made Emily's stomach turn. This was the source. This was what the house had been feeding all along, feeding on fear, on pain, on lives. The lives of her grandmother, of the generations before her, and now it wanted her. "No," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't let you have me." She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the pulsating mass. She had no plan, no weapon, nothing but her will to survive. But she knew that she had to end this. Had to sever the connection between the house and its cursed heart. As she reached the center of the room, the black mass pulsed harder, faster, as if sensing her defiance. The walls trembled, the air crackling with energy. Emily raised her hands, unsure of what she was doing, but knowing she had to do something. She closed her eyes, focusing all of her energy, all of her willpower on one thought. End this. Now. The room exploded with light. Emily was thrown backward, her body slamming into the stone wall behind her. She gasped for breath, her vision blurry as she tried to regain her bearings. The black mass writhed in agony, its form distorting and collapsing in on itself. The house shook violently, the walls cracking and splintering as if it were being torn apart from the inside. For a moment, Emily thought she had done it. She thought she had won. But then the light faded and the darkness returned. The house stilled, the tremors ceased, and the black mass slowly reformed, stronger than before. It pulsed with an even darker energy now, as though it had absorbed her attempt to destroy it and grown more powerful in the process. Emily collapsed to the floor, defeated, tears streaming down her face. There was no escape. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed all the others before her. She could feel it now, the tendrils of darkness wrapping around her soul, binding her to this place for eternity. As her vision dimmed and the last of her strength drained away, she heard the whispering again, soft and insistent. "Welcome home, Emily." And then there was only darkness. The house stood silent and still, nestled deep in the woods at the edge of town. The storm had passed, leaving only a few stray leaves and broken branches scattered across the lawn. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the property. Inside the house, everything appeared peaceful, just as it always did after the storm. The walls, the floors, the furniture all sat undisturbed, as though nothing had happened. And in the stillness of the parlor, a faint voice could be heard, carried on the wind. "Emily?" The house was waiting. "Da,"